Baghdad, July 1979. The air was thick with heat and tension. Two invisible forces pressing down on the capital like a suffocating blanket. Inside the corridors of the Ba'ath Party headquarters, men in uniforms and suits moved briskly but avoided one another's eyes. Their footsteps echoed against marble floors, each tap carrying the weight of uncertainty. Rumors had begun to spread, whispers of betrayal, of plots against the new president, Saddam Hussein. The country had changed hands only days earlier, yet already the walls seemed to listen. Saddam's portrait hung in every hall now. His mustached face, confident and composed, watched over them like a silent overseer. Behind that calm gaze, many suspected, lay a man who trusted no one. He had served for years under Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, quietly consolidating control, studying every weakness, rewarding loyalty but never affection. When Bakri resigned due to ill health, few dared to question the circumstances. Within a week, Saddam had become president, chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, and commander of the armed forces. He was Iraq. The transition should have been celebratory. Instead, fear crept through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party like a cold draft. Senior officials whispered that something was coming. No one knew when or what, but the unease was undeniable. Even those closest to Saddam, his ministers, generals and secretaries, felt the weight of invisible eyes upon them. The Iraqi intelligence services had grown omnipresent, their reports flowing directly to Saddam's desk. Men disappeared overnight. Some were said to have defected to Syria. Others simply ceased to exist. In the presidential palace, the newly anointed leader sat in silence, staring at a single document on his desk. It was a confession, a detailed account of a conspiracy, naming several party members who allegedly plotted to overthrow him. The confession had been extracted from Muhyi Mashadi, a man who had once sat only 2 chairs away from Saddam during meetings of the Revolutionary Command Council. Now his trembling handwriting confessed to high treason, claiming allegiance to Syrian intelligence. Saddam's dark eyes flicked over the words without emotion. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, a smile devoid of warmth. He set the paper down, folded his hands, and whispered to himself, "They will all learn loyalty." Outside, the city pulsed with both devotion and dread. Posters declared Saddam as the hero of the nation, while secret police vans prowled the streets. In coffee houses, conversations ceased whenever a stranger entered. The people had learned that silence was survival. Soldiers patrolled intersections, their rifles gleaming under the relentless sun. Even the call to prayer seemed subdued, its echoes absorbed by an atmosphere of caution. Within the Ba'ath Party compound, invitations began to circulate, formal letters bearing the seal of the president. All high-ranking officials were summoned to a special assembly at the Al-Qul Hall on July 22nd. The reason was not stated. Some believed it would be a celebration of Saddam's new presidency. Others suspected it might concern the ongoing tensions with Syria. No one dared to decline. Each envelope was a summons that could not be refused. Among those who received the letter was General Adnan Hamdani, a man who had served loyally since the 1968 revolution. His wife found him sitting in silence that evening, staring at the letter under the lamp's yellow light. "It's just a meeting," she said softly. "You've done nothing wrong." He smiled faintly but did not answer. Deep inside, he knew that in Saddam's Iraq, guilt was a matter of perception, not fact. That night, Baghdad did not sleep. The city's heartbeat was irregular, pulsing with apprehension. In the officers' quarters, men drank quietly, their conversations circling around the same question: who could be next? In the darkened hallways of the intelligence service, operatives prepared lists, checked files, cross-referenced names. The machinery of fear was already in motion. Meanwhile, Saddam convened with his closest advisors, Taha Yassin Ramadan, Barzan Ibrahim, and Ali Hassan al-Majid, his cousin. The room was dimly lit, smoke curling from cigarettes as they discussed the assembly. Taha leaned forward, his voice low. "Comrade President, are we certain of the timing?" Saddam looked at him steadily, unblinking. "Fear," he said slowly, "must arrive before rebellion. Let them witness what happens to traitors." He rose, walked to the window, and gazed over the darkened city. "Tomorrow, Iraq will understand who commands its destiny." As dawn approached, the streets of Baghdad remained eerily quiet. The Tigris reflected the faint glow of the morning sun like molten copper. Within the palace, aides moved with precision, preparing vehicles, checking lists, rehearsing protocols. Every detail had been orchestrated. The assembly was not just a meeting, it was theater. Saddam intended to stage a lesson that would be remembered for generations. By mid-morning, black sedans began to arrive at the gates of the Al-Kil Hall, one by one. Party officials stepped out, their faces tense behind forced smiles. Some greeted each other with hollow enthusiasm. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The hall itself had been meticulously prepared. Rows of seats faced a raised platform draped in red, with the emblem of the Ba'ath Party gleaming behind the podium. Armed guards stood discreetly at the edges, their eyes scanning every movement. At exactly 11 o'clock, a hush fell over the crowd. A convoy pulled up outside, and the hall doors opened. Saddam Hussein entered, dressed in a tailored olive military uniform, the gold insignia of his rank catching the light. The audience rose in unison, applauding mechanically. He acknowledged them with a slow, deliberate nod, then motioned for them to sit. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but carried the authority of inevitability. "Comrades," he began, "we are gathered today to speak of loyalty, unity, and the sacred duty to our revolution." His gaze swept across the room. But loyalty must be tested, and betrayal, no matter how deeply buried, must be exposed. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. Saddam paused, letting silence do the work. "We have uncovered a conspiracy," he continued. "A plot against our party, against Iraq itself. And today, you will see with your own eyes the face of treason." He signaled to an aide, and a door at the side of the stage opened. Two guards entered, escorting a man in a wrinkled suit, his head bowed, his steps uncertain. Gasps spread through the hall as they recognized Muhyi Mashadi. Mashadi looked pale, his face drawn, eyes sunken. He glanced once at Saddam, then quickly looked away. The guards positioned him before the podium. Saddam turned to the assembly. "This man," he said evenly, "has something to confess." The hall fell silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Mashadi's trembling hands clutched a few sheets of paper. His voice, hoarse but audible, broke the tension. I confess to being part of a plot," he began. "A plot organized by the Syrian branch of the Ba'ath Party to overthrow our president, Saddam Hussein." His words echoed, fragile and terrifying. Men exchanged glances. Some shifted in their seats, others stared straight ahead. Each syllable felt like a noose tightening around unseen necks. Saddam stood motionless, his expression unreadable. When Mashadi finished, he nodded slowly. "Thank you, comrade," he said quietly. Then, with a faint smile that chilled every man in the room, he added, "Now the truth begins." The audience sat frozen. Outside, Baghdad continued as if nothing had changed, but inside that hall, history had already taken a dark and irreversible turn. The morning of July 22, 1979, arrived with deceptive calm. Baghdad shimmered beneath the relentless sun, the city wrapped in its usual haze of dust and heat. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary day market, vendors shouting over the noise of the streets, soldiers at checkpoints waving through convoys, the scent of strong coffee wafting through open doors. But beneath the surface, a strange tension gripped the capital. Something was different. Something unseen. At the Al-Kil Hall, A large concrete structure on the edge of the Ba'ath Party compound, soldiers moved with purpose. They polished the marble floors, adjusted microphones, and checked security perimeters. The hall had been draped with crimson banners bearing the Ba'ath emblem, a stylized sun rising over the map of the Arab world. Portraits of Saddam Hussein hung along the walls, each painted slightly differently, one smiling, one stern, one heroic in a military cap. His presence dominated the room long before he even arrived. Outside the gates, black sedans arrived one after another. Each carried a high-ranking official, summoned by a sealed letter they had received days earlier. Some came alone. Others brought aides or bodyguards, though most were left outside. The men inside were uneasy. No one knew why they had been called, only that attendance was mandatory. The atmosphere was polite, but cold handshakes that lasted too long. Forced smiles that faded quickly. General Adnan Hamdani was among the first to arrive. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his face betrayed exhaustion. As he stepped out of his car, he saw familiar figures, ministers, colonels, party leaders, men who had shaped Iraq's revolution and who now avoided one another's gaze. "Comrade Adnan," one whispered, forcing a smile. "Perhaps the president will announce reforms." Another muttered, "Or promotions." The laughter that followed was brittle, hollow. Inside, the temperature was cool, but the air felt heavy. The officials took their seats, whispering in low tones. A few lit cigarettes, the smoke curling upward into the lights. On the stage, the podium stood empty, flanked by two guards who stared forward without expression. The front row was reserved for the most senior members of the Revolutionary Command Council. One seat remained conspicuously vacant. Mashadi's dot. At precisely 11 o'clock, the doors closed. Outside, guards took their positions. No one noticed that the exits were locked from the outside. Inside, the murmur of conversation faded as the lights dimmed slightly. An aide stepped onto the stage and announced in a firm voice, "Comrade President Saddam Hussein will now address the assembly." Every man in the hall rose to his feet as Saddam entered, wearing his olive green uniform and beret. His movements were slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable. He stopped at the center of the stage, let the applause die down, then looked out over the crowd. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence became unbearable. "My comrades," he began finally, his voice calm and steady. "We have gathered here today, not to celebrate, but to cleanse." A few men exchanged confused glances. Saddam continued, "Our revolution has endured for decades, but it is threatened by traitors who hide among us. They wear the same uniforms. They speak the same slogans. But in their hearts, they serve the enemies of Iraq." A murmur rippled through the hall. Saddam raised his hand, and the noise ceased instantly. "You will see the truth today," he said, his voice tightening. "And you will see it from one of your own." He turned to the side door and nodded. The audience shifted in their seats, waiting. Then, two guards entered, dragging a man between them. Gasps erupted. It was Mashadi. He looked almost unrecognizable. His hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled, his face pale and gaunt. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and his lips trembled as he was brought to the podium. Some of his colleagues tried to meet his eyes, but he avoided them, staring at the papers in his hands. Saddam gestured for him to speak. "Tell them," he said softly. "Tell your comrades what you told me." Mashadi's voice quavered. I confess," he began, each word weighed down by fear. "I confess that I was part of a conspiracy. Organized by the Syrian branch of our party, we sought to overthrow the leadership of Comrade Saddam Hussein and replace it with a puppet regime under Syrian control." A collective gasp filled the hall. Men shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others staring blankly. A few instinctively shouted, "Impossible!" But their voices quickly died. The guards' eyes swept the room, daring anyone to speak again. Mashadi continued, his voice cracking. I was misled. I betrayed the revolution. Others were involved. He stopped, his throat tightening. He looked at Saddam, who nodded coldly. Read the names, Saddam ordered. A long pause. Then, with trembling hands, Mashadi unfolded another sheet of paper. His eyes darted nervously over the lines. Adnan Hamdani, he said. The general's heart stopped. Around him, dozens of heads turned in his direction. His mouth went dry, but he managed to rise slowly, as expected, and say in a hoarse voice, Long live the party. His legs felt numb as guards approached him. He was led to the side door without resistance. Mashadi read another name. And another. Each time, the same ritual repeated, men rising, shouting the party slogan, then disappearing behind the curtain. Some cried out. Others refused to look up. Within minutes, 20 names had been called. Each name fell like a hammer blow, echoing through the hall, crushing the air from the room. Saddam watched from the stage, impassive, almost serene. Occasionally he leaned toward one of his aides and whispered something, prompting a subtle nod. The performance was unfolding exactly as he intended. The hall was silent except for Mashadi's shaking voice and the echo of footsteps as men were taken away. At one point, Mashadi faltered, lowering the paper. Comrade President, he said weakly, I have read all that was. Read, Saddam interrupted sharply. Until every name is spoken. Mashadi swallowed hard and continued. His hands shook so violently that the papers fluttered like wounded birds. By the time he finished, 68 men had been named. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one dared to breathe. Saddam stood and stepped forward. Comrades, he said quietly, you have seen how betrayal hides among us. These men will face justice. Iraq will be cleansed. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. Now I ask you, what punishment do traitors deserve? For a moment, no one spoke. Then a single voice, thin, desperate, shouted, Death! Another echoed it. Soon the hall was filled with cries of death, death. The noise grew until it became a feverish chant. Saddam raised his hand again, and silence returned. Then it shall be so, he said simply. The remaining officials erupted into applause, loud, forced, terrified. Some were crying. Others clapped mechanically, their eyes wide and glassy. Saddam smiled faintly, as if satisfied by their devotion, then turned and left the stage. The doors opened. The meeting was over. But everyone who left that hall knew that Iraq would never be the same again. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly, reflecting off the polished hoods of the waiting cars. Guards stood motionless, their rifles gleaming. As the officials filed out, each man's shadow stretched long and thin across the pavement, distorted by fear. Behind the locked doors, the chosen names were already being processed, interrogated, and condemned. Within hours, the purge had begun. The air inside the Ba'ath Party compound had turned thick and stagnant. As the final applause faded, a grim silence filled the corridors. Guards in khaki uniforms moved swiftly, separating the officials whose names had been called from those who remained. The men led away did not resist. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. A few whispered prayers under their breath. Others walked as if already dead. The heavy steel doors of the conference hall slammed shut behind them. Outside, a few surviving ministers stood in disbelief. They had clapped, shouted, "Death to traitors!" But now that the hall was empty, their trembling hands betrayed their fear. One of them muttered, "May God forgive us all," before realizing that even whispering could be dangerous. Down a dim corridor, the condemned were herded into a holding room. It was narrow, windowless, and smelled of sweat and dust. The walls were bare, except for a single portrait of Saddam, painted in bright oils, his smile unnerving in the flickering fluorescent light. A soldier barked orders, "Sit! No talking!" The men obeyed instantly. Among them sat General Adnan Hamdani. His heart hammered against his ribs. Just hours earlier, he had expected to attend a routine meeting. Now he was branded a traitor. He stared at his hands, strong, scarred hands that had once held the fate of divisions, and realized how useless they were now. Across the room, another officer began to sob quietly. No one dared to comfort him. In an adjoining chamber, Saddam's inner circle gathered. Tariq Aziz stood by the wall, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. "Comrade President," he said cautiously, "should we proceed with immediate interrogation?" Saddam exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the closed-circuit television monitor showing the detainees. "Yes," he said finally. "Let the others see what loyalty means." He turned to his aide and added coldly, "Film everything." Moments later, the first of the accused was brought into a small interrogation room. A single overhead lamp cast a harsh cone of light. Mashadi was there too, trembling, forced to confirm each accusation on camera. Each man was asked the same question: who else was involved? Each answer dragged another name into the fire. The purge was self-feeding, a machinery of fear devouring itself. Outside, the hall's remaining members were locked in, forbidden to leave. They could hear the distant sounds: boots on concrete, muffled cries, sometimes a single gunshot. Hours passed like days. Sweat trickled down collars, cigars burned to ash. Nobody spoke. Each man rehearsed, silently, what he would say if summoned next. By midnight, 30 more names had been extracted. Saddam watched the footage replayed on a small screen, his expression unreadable. "Weakness," he murmured, "is a disease." He poured himself a glass of water, then turned to his guards. "Execute them before dawn. Make it quiet. Make it efficient." The orders spread quickly. Trucks were prepared. The condemned, blindfolded and bound, were marched through the compound courtyard. The night was windless, the air hot and heavy. Under the harsh floodlights, their shadows stretched long across the gravel. No one begged. There was only silence, the kind that comes when men know the end has already been decided. At 3:40 a.m., the first volley of gunfire cracked through the air. The echo rolled across the Tigris River like distant thunder. Guards stood motionless, staring straight ahead. When the smoke cleared, the bodies lay in rows, their uniforms dark with dust and blood. By sunrise, the ground had been washed clean. Inside the compound, Saddam remained awake, seated behind his desk. The faint light of dawn crept through the blinds. He wrote a single line in his journal: "The revolution must always feed on its own to stay alive." Outside, Baghdad stirred to life as if nothing had happened. The city had learned not to ask questions. The posters of Saddam that lined the streets seemed to watch every passerby, smiling, eternal, merciless. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the Ba'ath Party Assembly Hall, but its warmth did nothing to chase away the dread that hung heavy in the air. The men who remained party elites, ministers, army officers, sat rigidly in their seats. Their uniforms and suits were pressed, their collars neat, but their faces were pale and drawn. No one dared to move. The previous night's executions were known, though unspoken. Baghdad was awake, but its heart was cold. The hall's doors opened sharply. Soldiers in brown uniforms entered, rifles slung over their shoulders. Behind them walked Saddam Hussein, calm, composed, and terrifyingly certain of himself. He wore his olive-green military uniform with a brown belt and polished boots, his hair perfectly combed, his mustache trimmed. The glint of his wristwatch caught the light as he raised his hand. The room fell utterly silent. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he paced slowly before the audience, his black eyes scanning every face as if memorizing each soul. A faint smile played on his lips. The tension was unbearable. Even the sound of boots on the marble echoed like thunder. Finally, Saddam stopped at the podium. "Comrades," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "Yesterday we exposed a conspiracy within our ranks, a plot to betray the revolution." He let the words hang, his tone almost casual, like a teacher explaining a lesson. But the rot runs deeper than we imagined. At a signal from him, the double doors at the side of the hall opened. 2 guards entered, dragging a man between them. It was Muhyi Mashadi, the party secretary general, pale, sweating, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His suit jacket hung loosely, his tie askew. Once a powerful man, he now looked like a broken puppet. Gasps rippled through the audience. Many recognized him. Some had worked under him for years, but no one dared speak. Saddam watched the reactions carefully, eyes narrowing at anyone who looked shocked. Mashadi was forced onto the stage. A microphone was placed before him. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. Saddam gestured with his hand. "Speak," he said softly, almost kindly. "Tell your comrades the truth." Mashadi's voice finally broke through the silence, hoarse, uncertain. "Comrades," he began, I stand before you guilty. I was part of a plot against the revolution, against our president." The hall erupted in murmurs. Saddam raised his hand again, and silence fell immediately. Mashadi's confession continued, each word slower and heavier than the last. "We conspired with Syrian elements to overthrow our leadership. I have betrayed you all." He hesitated, looking out at the rows of familiar faces. "But I was not alone." That sentence froze the air. Saddam leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. He gestured again, and a soldier handed Mashadi a sheet of paper. His hands shook as he unfolded it. The microphone hissed. He began to read names. Each name struck the audience like a blow. Some men gasped. Others looked down in disbelief. A few began to sob quietly. The list seemed endless: ministers, officers, party secretaries, men who had dined with Saddam, sworn loyalty, toasted the revolution. Now they were condemned by one of their own: Comrade Khalid, Comrade Salam, General Hamdani. Mashadi's voice cracked as he read. He paused, tears welling in his eyes. Saddam watched him with a predator's patience. When the reading stopped, there was silence. Then, unexpectedly, Saddam applauded. The sound of his hands clapping alone echoed through the hall. Slowly, others joined in, uncertainly at first, then more loudly, until the hall was filled with forced applause, a macabre symphony of obedience. Saddam smiled. "You see, comrades," he said, "even among us, betrayal festers. But the party is pure because we cleanse it." His voice grew harder. "Loyalty is not claimed, it is proven." He turned toward Mashadi, who stood trembling. "You have done your duty," Saddam said. "Now let those names stand." Every man whose name had been read hesitated. Some rose immediately, trying to appear defiant. Others had to be pulled to their feet. The hall became a sea of confusion, half of the men standing, half still seated, all afraid. Saddam scanned them slowly, expressionless. "These men," he said, "will be taken for questioning. The revolution will judge them." At that signal, soldiers entered and began dragging the named men toward the exits. One of them cried out, "President, I am innocent." The words hung in the air, desperate and useless. Saddam didn't even glance his way. As the doors closed behind the condemned, Saddam turned back to the remaining audience. "Let this be a lesson," he said quietly. "Loyalty is life. Doubt is death." No one breathed. The applause resumed, slower, mechanical, endless. The sound followed Saddam as he left the hall, his boots echoing on marble, his shadow stretching long behind him. That night, Mashadi was taken to an undisclosed location. He would never be seen again. The room was still echoing from the sound of applause when the doors closed again. Outside, Baghdad's heat shimmered, but inside the Ba'ath Party hall, the air felt frozen, heavy with terror. The men who remained sat stiffly, eyes fixed forward, pretending calm while their hearts pounded like drums. They had watched their comrades dragged away. Now they wondered which of them would be next. At the podium, Saddam Hussein stood perfectly still. His eyes, dark and watchful, lingered on the trembling crowd before him. On the table beside him lay a folder, thick, bound in red leather, stamped with the golden emblem of the Ba'ath Party. He touched it gently, as if it contained both the fate and the lesson of the nation. The revolution, he began slowly, his voice steady, is not a gift to be taken for granted. It must be protected from enemies outside and from traitors within. His tone was calm, almost fatherly, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Even the sound of soldiers shifting their rifles at the door seemed deafening. He opened the folder. Inside was a list. Dozens of names typed neatly on pale paper, marked with red ink. The paper fluttered slightly under the ceiling fan, a fragile thing that held absolute power. Saddam looked up. "Comrade Mashadi has confessed," he said evenly. "He has revealed every name. These are not rumors. These are facts." His hand lifted the list, and every man in the hall seemed to shrink smaller in his seat. He began to read. The first name fell like a hammer. Comrade Adnan Hamdani. A pause. Heads turned, some toward the man himself, others toward the ground. Hamdani rose shakily to his feet. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Saddam nodded slightly. Guards approached and took him by the arms. He did not resist. The second name. Then the third. The fourth. With each one, a soldier stepped forward, a chair scraped, a gasp filled the air. The rhythm became mechanical, ritualistic, a procession of guilt. Orchestrated by one man's voice, some men broke down completely. One collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, crying out, "I swear I am loyal." The guards dragged him away anyway. Others stood in silence, eyes glazed, resigned to whatever came next. Each movement was a small death. By the 10th name, the hall was chaos barely contained. Men whispered frantic prayers under their breath, fingers trembling. One officer muttered to himself, "If I stay still, maybe I disappear." But no one disappeared in Saddam's Iraq. The list went on. 20 names, 30, 40, until finally Saddam stopped. His voice never faltered. He placed the list down, exhaled, and looked across the remaining crowd, half of them gone. The others paralyzed. "Those who remain," he said, "have proven their loyalty by surviving this moment." His tone was almost kind. "History will remember you as faithful servants of the revolution." He smiled faintly. The gesture sent a shiver through every man in the room. They applauded, slow, desperate, mechanical, their palms clapping like the ticking of a clock counting down to their turn. Outside, trucks idled in the courtyard, waiting to take the condemned away. Soldiers loaded them one by one, like cargo. No one screamed now. The executions had become routine, the machinery of fear running with perfect precision. Saddam returned to his office, where the list was placed before him once more. He dipped his pen in red ink and marked the top corner, confirmed. Then, turning to his aides, he said quietly, "Send the families notice. Loyalty must be taught through blood." That night, the streets of Baghdad were silent. Radio stations played patriotic songs, praising the unity of the party. No one mentioned the names of the men who had vanished. Their faces were already being erased from photographs. Their houses sealed, their families watched. And yet, in the heart of the capital, a few dared to whisper, "He's killing his own." But even whispers had consequences. In the palace, Saddam stood by his balcony, looking out over the sleeping city. The Tigris shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Behind him, the list of names lay on his desk, ink still wet. He murmured to himself almost tenderly, Fear is the foundation of loyalty. The air in the Ba'ath Party Hall was thick with the scent of sweat and cigarette smoke. Hours had passed since Saddam Hussein began reading the list of names, yet the hall still trembled with silence. Men sat frozen in their seats, afraid even to breathe too loudly. The guards remained motionless along the walls, rifles at their sides, their eyes hidden behind cold steel helmets. Saddam stood at the podium again. His uniform was immaculate despite the long hours. Olive green fabric stretched across his broad shoulders, gold insignia gleaming faintly in the dim light. His eyes swept over the hall, calm yet deadly. When he spoke, his voice carried an eerie composure. "Comrades," he began, "the Ba'ath Party has been betrayed." The words landed like hammer blows. Nobody dared move. He gestured toward the paper on the podium, the same list of condemned names that had silenced the room before. These men plotted against our revolution. They conspired with foreign powers, with traitors who wished to destroy Iraq. But today, he paused, his gaze shifting slowly from face to face. Justice will be done. Behind him, several officers stood still, their faces unreadable. Among them, Barzan Ibrahim, Saddam's half-brother, watched the hall with cold precision. He whispered something to another aide, who nodded and disappeared through a side door. Somewhere beyond those walls, the sound of trucks starting echoed faintly. Saddam took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "Those who remain loyal," he said, "must prove it now." A murmur of confusion swept the hall. Men looked at one another, unsure of what he meant. Saddam's expression did not change. He simply raised his hand, and the doors at the back burst open. A dozen soldiers entered, dragging several men whose names had been read earlier. Their faces were swollen, their suits torn, eyes wide with despair. The condemned were forced to kneel before the podium. Some tried to speak, to beg, but their words were swallowed by the silence. Saddam observed them for a moment, then turned back to the crowd. "These traitors," he said slowly, "will be punished. But tell me, comrades, what punishment does treason deserve?" No one answered at first. The question hung in the air like a blade. Saddam waited. Then, from the back of the hall, a voice shouted, "Death!" The words snapped through the silence like a gunshot. Another man echoed it, "Death!" And soon the entire hall roared with the same cry, "Death! Death! Death!" The chant grew louder, desperate, until it filled the hall with an animal frenzy. Saddam raised his hand again, and the shouting ceased immediately. He smiled faintly, a thin, cold smile. "You have spoken," he said. "The verdict is death." The condemned shook violently. One man collapsed forward, sobbing. Another shouted that he was innocent, but the guards silenced him with the butt of a rifle. Saddam did not flinch. He turned to his officers. "The revolution must be protected," he said softly. "Those loyal to me will carry out the sentence." A ripple of shock moved through the audience. They understood what he meant. They themselves would become the executioners. Men who had once shared meals and meetings with the condemned were now to pull the trigger. The message was clear. Loyalty was measured not by words, but by blood. Saddam began calling names again, this time of those who would serve as firing squads. Each name was followed by a visible tremor. Some tried to protest, their voices breaking, but the guards stood ready. One by one, they stepped forward, pale and trembling dot in the far corner. An officer vomited quietly into his hands. Another man whispered a prayer. The hall reeked of fear. Saddam watched them all with the detached calm of a god, deciding who would live and who would die. When the last name was read, Saddam descended from the podium. His boots echoed on the marble floor. He walked past the kneeling men, their faces drenched in tears, and stopped before the first condemned. "You should have remained loyal," he said softly. "But your weakness betrayed you." Then, without another glance, he turned and left the hall. As soon as he exited, the soldiers began shouting orders. The chosen executioners were herded toward the courtyard behind the building. The condemned were dragged after them. Outside, the sun had already set, and the compound was bathed in the deep red of dusk. Searchlights flickered on, cutting across the darkness. In the courtyard, rows of rifles waited against a wall. The men assigned to execute hesitated, staring at the weapons with hollow eyes. "Do it," a commander barked. "Prove your loyalty." The condemned were lined up against a wall, the same wall that bore the faded marks of older executions. Some cried for their families. Others were too numb to speak. The night was heavy with the smell of dust and oil. When the first volley of shots rang out, the sound echoed like thunder. A flock of crows scattered into the dark sky. The firing continued, short, mechanical bursts, until only silence remained. From a high balcony overlooking the courtyard, Saddam watched the scene unfold. The light from a nearby torch flickered across his face, revealing neither joy nor remorse, only the calm satisfaction of control. He turned away before the last shots were fired. Inside, the surviving members of the Ba'ath Party remained in their seats, stunned. The echo of gunfire reached them faintly through the walls. Some wept silently, others stared blankly ahead. The revolution had devoured its own children, and they knew it. When Saddam returned, he walked slowly through the hall, his boots clicking against the stone floor. "The Ba'ath Party," he announced, "is now purified." No one applauded, no one moved. He surveyed their faces, pale, broken, obedient. Then he nodded once. "Long live the revolution." The words fell like ashes. The purges would continue for days after, but in that moment, the fate of every man in the hall was sealed. Those who lived would never forget what loyalty meant under Saddam Hussein. The courtyard of the Ba'ath Party headquarters was drowned in shadow. The heavy doors shut behind the last group of condemned men, locking out the faint echo of the hall where their fate had been decided. Above, the stars were dull and veiled by a blanket of desert dust. The faint hum of power lines trembled through the night air, mingling with the low murmur of fear. Dozens of men stood in formation, some condemned, others chosen as executioners. None could tell who trembled more. The chosen stood in two lines, rifles pressed to their chests, their faces pale under the yellow searchlights. The condemned knelt before the old brick wall scarred by bullets from years of previous purges. The smell of gun oil hung thick in the air. Saddam Hussein watched from a balcony high above. His uniform gleamed faintly under the lights. His hands were clasped behind his back. Around him stood his guards and half-brother, Barzan Ibrahim, his expression rigid as carved stone. "Begin," Saddam said quietly. His voice carried across the courtyard like the rustle of sand in the wind. The commander below saluted sharply. "Yes, President." He turned to the terrified men holding rifles, party members who had, until hours ago, shared drinks and laughter with the condemned. "Step forward." One by one, they did, stumbling, some barely able to stand. The commander barked orders, and the rifles were loaded. The sound of metal sliding against metal was sharp, final. "Take aim." The executioners raised their rifles, tears welling in some eyes. The condemned muttered prayers, clutching at hope that no longer existed. "Fire!" The first volley shattered the night. A cloud of smoke and dust burst upward. When it cleared, bodies slumped to the ground, lifeless. A few executioners dropped their rifles, shaking violently. One of them vomited. Saddam's gaze did not waver. He turned to Barzan. "These men are learning loyalty," he said coldly. "Fear is the greatest teacher." Another group of condemned was dragged forward. The same ritual repeated, the commands, the hesitation, the thunder of shots. The courtyard reeked of gunpowder and iron. As the night wore on, fatigue and terror merged into numbness. The executioners no longer looked at the faces of the condemned. They aimed at shadows, shooting because their lives depended on it. A few tried to look up at the balcony, searching. for mercy, but Saddam had already disappeared into the darkness beyond the torchlight. Inside the headquarters, in a small chamber lit by one flickering bulb, Saddam removed his gloves. His aide handed him a glass of tea. "It's done?" Saddam asked. "Nearly, sir," the aide replied. Saddam nodded. "Good. Make sure the bodies are buried before dawn. I want no trace of them inside the capital." He walked to a mirror, studying his reflection. His face was calm, unreadable, the face of a man who believed himself the embodiment of order. For a moment, the faint sound of gunfire drifted in from outside. It seemed distant, almost ceremonial. In the courtyard, the final group of condemned men was brought forward. Among them was an elderly officer whose son had already been executed that evening. He stared at the ground, silent. When told to kneel, he obeyed without protest. One of the chosen executioners began to sob openly. "I can't do it," barked the commander, slapping him across the face. "You want to join them?" The man's hands trembled as he lifted his rifle. The commander stood behind him, watching closely. "Fire!" The old officer fell without a sound. Silence followed. Even the desert wind seemed to pause. The commander wiped his forehead, his voice hoarse. "It's finished." In the distance, the faint glow of dawn began to rise, a gray, empty light creeping over Baghdad. Trucks arrived to collect the bodies, piling them under tarps. The executioners stood in a daze, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat. None dared speak. When Saddam reappeared in the courtyard just before sunrise, everyone straightened instantly. He surveyed the scene, the wall dark with stains, the ground littered with shell casings. He said nothing for a long moment, then finally spoke. "Those who obeyed tonight have proven their devotion." He paused. "Those who faltered, I will remember their faces." The survivors stiffened. They understood the warning. Saddam turned and walked away as the morning call to prayer echoed faintly in the distance. To him, it was the sound of victory, the anthem of control. But for those who had held the rifles, it would forever mark the night they became both victims and perpetrators of his power. In the coming weeks, the city whispered of what had happened. Families vanished. Rumors spread that even some executioners had later disappeared, silenced to erase all witnesses. The revolution, cleansed in blood, marched forward beneath the shadow of its master. From that night on, no one in Iraq doubted that Saddam Hussein ruled not just with fear, but through it. The summer of 1979 settled heavily over Baghdad, thick heat, shimmering air, and an uneasy calm that hung like dust over the capital. Days after the Purge, the Ba'ath Party moved with mechanical obedience. Every office, every military compound, every home of rank echoed the same fear. "Saddam sees all. In public," he smiled. His portraits multiplied across the city, on government walls, school buildings, and even bakeries. His mustached face became an emblem of stability, but in private, whispers of horror followed him like shadows. Families of the executed men disappeared overnight. Trucks arrived silently, loading belongings under the cover of curfew. Their houses were reassigned to loyalists. Even their names were erased from party lists. As if they had never existed. In one of those houses, a young widow sat in the corner, clutching a torn photograph of her husband, one of the men executed that night. Her son, barely 6, asked her why his father wasn't coming home. She told him quietly, "He's serving the nation." It was the only safe answer. At the presidential palace, Saddam reviewed reports of renewed party unity. His ministers bowed, their smiles tight. Behind those smiles, a shared understanding that one mistake, one word, could end everything. Barzan Ibrahim entered the room, his posture tense but respectful. "The executions have restored order," he said. Saddam nodded slowly. "Fear breeds loyalty. Love fades. Fear endures." He turned toward the balcony. The Tigris River glimmered faintly below, catching the pale light of dawn. History will remember me not as a man who punished, he said, but as one who purified. Barzan remained silent. He had seen the courtyard. He had heard the cries. But he also knew silence was survival. That year, Iraq celebrated its new era of unity. Parades filled the streets, banners of green and red rippling in the wind. Military orchestras played under the burning sun, while the crowd cheered for the man who had turned fear into discipline. Children waved flags. Women ululated. The television cameras captured every smile. Saddam stood on the grandstand, his hand raised in salute, the embodiment of strength. Behind him, the generals who had trembled during the Purge now stood proudly, medals shining on their chests. None dared to look away. When the anthem ended, Saddam leaned toward his aide and whispered, "Do they love me?" The aide smiled carefully. "They fear you, sir." Saddam's lips curved slightly. "Good, then they will never forget me." Years passed. The Purge became legend, retold in whispers, reimagined in rumor. Some said Saddam had wept afterward. Others said he slept soundly. In truth, he had simply continued building monuments, declaring wars, scripting his own mythology in blood and marble. But in the quiet of the palace nights, when the corridors were still and the air was thick with perfume and power, he would sometimes walk alone to the courtyard. The same courtyard where loyalty had been tested in gunfire. He would stand there, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. The stains were long washed away, the wall repainted, but he knew. He remembered every name, every face. Not with guilt, but with satisfaction. For in his mind, he had become eternal. Outside those walls, the people learned to live with fear as if it were air. Students memorized slogans. Teachers praised the leader. The newspapers told stories of his wisdom and courage. Dissent vanished before it had the chance to breathe. And yet, in the backstreets of Baghdad, in hidden rooms and dim cafes, quiet voices still spoke of that summer, of the Purge, of the night when men killed their brothers to prove devotion. They told their children, "Do not speak of it, but never forget." In 2003, decades later, the regime would fall. Statues would crumble. The palaces would be looted. And in that same courtyard, buried under sand and time, archaeologists would uncover shell casings and fragments of uniforms. Relics of that single night that reshaped a nation. One historian wrote, "The tyranny of fear is not born in war. It begins with silence, when men applaud what they should condemn." As the world looked back on Saddam Hussein's rule, that night in 1979 became the defining symbol of his power. The moment he transformed the Ba'ath Party into an instrument of absolute obedience. His legacy was not carved in stone or victory, but in the invisible scars carried by millions who lived under his shadow. The sound of gunfire had long faded, but its echo remained in the cautious laughter of a people who learned never to trust the sound of applause. And in the heart of history, Saddam still stood, a figure lit by the same cold light that once bathed the courtyard, forever frozen between fear and immortality.